Good evening. I'm your host, James Ransom Reed Jr., and this is What's Your Story? Part one was my wonderful guest, Lisa Timothy, she's the director of the East Lyme Public Library. You got to know all about her and who she was and how she got to be where she is today, the struggles she's had, both physically and emotionally, and dealing with COVID, and what a library offers today. We educate you. This part, we talk about her involvement with what we know as York Correctional Facility down in Niantic, which is the only female prison in the state of Connecticut. I hope you will enjoy learning some of the history of York as I welcome back to the show, Lisa Timothy. Welcome back, Lisa.
Thank you.
All right, let's get right to it. The facility opened in, it opened in 1918.
1918.
Right. So tell people what it started as and what was its original name.
Well, let me back up just a little bit and explain my involvement.
All right. Okay.
My involvement with the prison is from the outside.
All right.
I've never been incarcerated there, but I've had my hands on some really good archives. The story of the prison has never really been explored, or hasn't been explored to the extent that it should. And over the years, I've picked up different artifacts that explain how the institution was founded and what it was. And I've just become interested in researching that as much as I can.
Yes.
And learning about it. In 1918, it started with 3 farms that were put together and 5 old wooden farmhouses, rickety farmhouses. But it was came out of the progressive movement of the earliest 20th century and was set up to be a place where women who had fallen into bad ways could learn skills, could improve their lives and whatnot.
Sure. So it, excuse me, it was part of the progressive movement at that period in time.
Right.
Why Greenwich? Why Niantic?
That's a good question. They set up a committee to find a good place to put this project that they wanted to start to help women get back on their feet. And there were 21 sites in Connecticut that were looked at. The one that was chosen just happened to be in Niantic. It was, again, I don't know much more than that. I do have to have a disclaimer. I'm not a historian.
That's okay.
I can just sort of tell you around the edges.
Absolutely. You can tell me about your involvement.
Yeah, what those edges are.
Yes, yes.
But they wanted somewhere where they could farm and grow food. They wanted a lake, water supply, and whatnot. And they wanted it to be near a railroad station. And there was the railroad line on the shoreline there. So that was that spot they felt was best for what they wanted to set up.
So this started out as a farm.
For the most part. It was also a school. There was also trades, but they grew all of their own food. It was a 1,000-acre farm. It was one of the bigger dairies in Connecticut. They produced an abundance of healthy food. They supplied other state agencies in southeastern Connecticut.
So what were some type of offenses that women would be sent there for?
I don't have a good handle on that, but anything from drunkenness, being pregnant out of wedlock was one, falling into the ways of vice, I think was what they called it. And sadly, much the same things that they're sent there for today, whether it's abuse or being abusive, abused, a lot of those things haven't changed.
That facility was, pardon the pun here, of women, for women, and by women.
Yes.
Women ran it.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that, please?
That was what caught my interest. My undergraduate work was done at Smith College, which is still an all-women's college. And the women who founded this, it was run by women, for women, in a way that promoted women. The women who were transferred there in 1918 had been imprisoned at Wethersfield before that, which was a men's prison. And obviously it just was not an ideal situation to have co-ed jails, prisons. So they set up this to be an experiment to teach women to have trades and get an education and learn how to get back on their feet.
So there was education there too?
Yes, yeah. And there is now too.
So you mean there was actual correction going on?
Yes, you could say that, yeah. not so much punitive, but it was a more progressive approach. They wanted to, a lot of the women who were running it came out of public health backgrounds, sociology, and the Elizabeth Munger, one of the first wardens, yeah, had been trained at the University of Chicago and had, rubbed shoulders with John Dewey, and not that he's the best example, but Hull House, Jane Addams.
Tell people about, Hull House?
Not a lot, just it was a settlement work where they were helping immigrants,
adjust.
poverty, people stuck in poverty, whatnot.
Yes.
So it was social work, what we would now call social work. What we would now call social work.
Yes.
And they set this up to be, again, a place that was supportive of women who had fallen into bad ways, and trying to, rather than punitive, try to get them to give them a leg up to get back on their feet in society.
Now, I saw your presentation online, and if I'm not mistaken, I saw a picture of women with a maypole.
Yes, yeah. This is what fascinated me. I mean, I just mentioned I'd gone to Smith College. When you look at the opening pictures, the pictures from the farm in the opening years, the difference between a Seven Sisters College and the prison looks kind of thin. They got maypoles, they're sledding. It's bizarre. This doesn't look like a prison, right? What's going on here? And pretty much the women's colleges and the women's prisons were born about the same time for the same reason. Different reasons, different populations, but for the same reason, to the betterment of women. And so those pictures show that story. That, sledding, maypoles, and things like that going on.
Talk about your presentation, Lisa. Did I get it right, or were women there actually being educated?
Yes.
So that they could get degrees?
They could get skills. They could learn sewing. They could learn farming. They could learn,
Now, this was while it was under the tutelage of the women.
Right. They lived in cottages. They wore their own clothes. They grew their own food. They cooked their own food. They, learned skills. Now, it's not all rainbows and unicorns. There's obviously problems. Women were held against their will, and there were things that might have been done with the best of intentions that necessarily weren't progressive. But for the time, they tried that. And where that becomes important to me is that when you look at the arguments for opening up the farm 100 years ago, the dialogue reads almost identical to what you would say today. These women are either abused, addicted, having, one issue or another. And it can get very frustrating because it looks like the needle hasn't moved at all in 100 years. The same thing that we're dealing with now is what we were dealing with then. Except that you have 100 years of history. We've been here before, because I know the DOC is making efforts to, at least with some of the women, start programs that are, they're doing the best they can with what they have. They're not always given the resources. No politician gets elected saying, I want to give money to the prison. It's not how our society works. And so there's a 100-year history of that pendulum back and forth. Do we get to the root of the problem, or is this punitive? Is it progressive or is it punitive? And it goes back and forth in different times. And somebody needs to sit down and look at that history and understand what happened here. It's a fascinating story that hasn't been told. And part of my interest in it and what I'd like to see is that history be told in a grassroots way. I met a woman named Kelsey Kaufman.
Yes.
And she started a program at the Indiana Women's Prison. And she was doing college courses. And within the first week or two, they were looking at the history of the prison. The women in her class who were incarcerated had incredible ideas and theories and whatnot that were so far from anything she had thought of. Because of course they would. You can't tell the story of a prison without the voices of the women who are in there, or the men. Those voices have to take a center seat because they're going to know things and tell things that nobody else can. So I was fascinated by her approach to that. And if the history of York is to be told, I'd like to see it as a grassroots effort, or history by group, academically, but with also the women who are incarcerated, with the town. The town of East Lyme had, before 1968, had a lot to do with the farm. That they went down there for events. There were parades, there were pageants, there were movies. And the older residents in East Lyme remember that. They remember when the prison was part of the community. And again, that's not all unicorn and rainbows.
I got
Again, there were
no.
problems. You
always
it
had
wasn't always
problems,
good. Yeah,
but by and large, it was mostly positive. Yes.
As a library director, I had book discussion groups where we would read things about the Holocaust, and did the Germans know that this was in their town? They had these prisons, and the discussion would get interesting because the people in the town would say, "Well, we have a prison here in the middle of our town, and it's not spoken of much anymore." And I'm not saying the people there are ignorant; that we all know the prison's there. But it's removed from the town now. It's state property. It's the younger people almost never mention it. The older people have memories of a very different kind of place that functioned differently. So that just seemed to me interesting. That I'm stuck here.
No, that's no. But what you did was
Yeah.
That background that you just gave was fascinating in and of itself.
Yeah, there's something there that switched very abruptly in 1968 when
it changed to the DOT.
Right.
Yeah.
It became a very different institution, and again, maybe for good intentions, but it led to the mass incarceration and the war on drugs and the problem we have now with the over incarceration. And I know there's a movement now to recognize that and to bring education back into the prisons and to understand, to tackle the problem at its root. But the thing is, we've been here before. In 1918, we were in the same spot. So why we need to look at what happened that got us to where we are now, so that as we start, the pendulum swings back to the progressive, that we don't go down that path again. That what happened last time that derailed this system and made
I suspect
a mess.
Economics, money had something to do with
Money,
it.
yeah, money goes up and down, and of course it does. Just again, politicians don't get elected saying, I want to fix the prison. It's not a popular thing with most people, the general public. But
We do have that attitude.
We do have that attitude.
That if you go to prison, that's where you belong. You should be there.
Yeah.
Lock them up and throw away the key.
Right.
We do have that attitude. That's very prevalent in our society.
Right.
We are not so much focused on correction.
Right. How did these people end up here? Nobody wakes up and says, I want to go to prison today. But here we are. We have people who end up there. And there are a few notorious cases.
Oh,
and
yeah.
unfortunately, those cases get all the attention.
Oh, yes.
You're a psycho killer. Of course you should be behind bars. Well, the vast majority of, particularly with women who were incarcerated, are there because they were abused, because, and they took up drugs, or, something happened that necessarily isn't sensational, that isn't violent, that isn't, something that they necessarily can't be in the community with as they're working through. They don't have to necessarily be behind bars. And I know that within the prison reform movement right now, there's a lot of discussion that even people who are violent, should be in the community. That goes back and forth, but certainly we don't need to have people incarcerated in the numbers that they're incarcerated right now. A lot more of that, again, progressively could be dealt with in other ways by fixing the root of the problem. And again, we're turning toward that as a society a little bit, not enough, but in my opinion, but a little bit. But we need to understand better how that gets derailed as it goes back and forth.
Lisa, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say in 1918, women had babies too. Is that right?
Yeah.
So what happened at
19? That's another interesting part of this. 1918, they opened the prison. Well, within 2 years, they have 60 babies hanging around, because if you have women who are getting pregnant out of wedlock and whatnot, you're going to have babies. And when Elizabeth Munger, the first warden, took over, she inherited, like I said, 5 rickety wooden houses and 3 farms that were thrown together. By the time she leaves 20 years later, there's a whole campus there's a modern hospital, baby and mother hospital, there's, a school, there's a library, there's cottages and whatnot. There's a real move to try to make this work. And again, not saying that it was perfect, not saying that there weren't problems in there. Sure. It was predominantly white. It was predominantly for white women to go to, although there are some black women. We do have pictures of black women here and there. So there's a story there. I'd love to know what it is. I don't know what it is, but it wasn't exclusively white, but it was predominantly white. And I lost where I was going again.
Yeah.
It becomes, the first few decades, it does have modern medicine. They got women physicians to deal with women's issues. You know, the only men anywhere near the place were men who helped with the farm, the heavy farm equipment and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah.
And again, these were men who lived in town, and
Yeah,
you know, it
yeah.
was a community thing.
So when the first warden arrived, Mrs. Munger, was like wooden cabins or something.
Yeah, old farmhouses.
Old
She
farmhouses.
wasn't the first. There were two or three right off the bat, and there was a decades-long battle in Connecticut back and forth about whether or not to have a women's prison or not. And Connecticut takes a long time to decide to do this. And the first few years that the prison is open, or the farm is open, there's a scandal, and just from the quick read that I've done, again, I'm not an expert on this. I want to make that clear. I'm not an expert.
You're fine.
It seems like some of that battle continues for the first few years. They go through a few directors, and there's controversy back and forth about what are we doing here? What's really going on?
Yes.
When Miss Munger comes in, she's got an education behind her. She's done social work. She's been at University of Chicago with some of the leading reformists in the country, and she sits down and says, "Okay, we're going to have a hospital, you know, for babies and mothers, and we're going to have women doctors here to help these women and whatnot." And she sets up what is really a small campus of sturdy buildings. Sadly, those buildings are still there, but every few years the state of Connecticut talks about tearing them down because they're old and they're expensive to maintain. But they are historic buildings. I've often wanted to contact SHPO, state preservation. You know, these are historic buildings. Niantic was known across the nation. People came from all over the country to see what was going on here. This was, you know, a place that was plugged into national theories, and people nationally were interested in what was going on here.
In terms of
the corrections.
Yeah.
What was, you know, it wasn't a small backwoods prison or something. This was a place where people were coming to learn how to do progressive rehabilitation.
So you mentioned Elizabeth Munger and Kelsey Kaufman. Gladys Tantaquidjian.
Gladys Tantaquidjian is a Mohawk medicine woman. She's also an anthropologist trained at the University of Pennsylvania. She has some connection to the prison, but in the late 1940s, she's the librarian there, and she's working in the education school. I don't know anything more than that. I just know that she's there. We have pictures of her there. Her museum in Uncasville has, I think it's Uncasville, you know, does mention in a very small section of one of their displays that she was involved with that. It seems like she might have been working exclusively with women of color, but I'm not quite sure. We're not sure exactly what she was doing, but there was Native American connections to the prison at that time, which is just fascinating stuff. And again, I wish I knew more. I'm hoping to find out more. I'm hoping to put together that grassroots history effort to try to find out, you know, what is this institution in our town? How does it affect that? You know, what really was going on here? But again, predominantly white, but not exclusively. There were other races there too. And we have a picture of a white woman taking care of black children. And of course, in our society, it's almost always the inverse, right? That's just not how our society had been set up. So I've often looked at that picture and thought, what's going on here? Is it just a fluke, or what were these women trying to do?
What got to your soul about this? Because you do that presentation so wonderfully. It's so replete with information. I know you have speakers come in who are more experienced in various areas.
Yeah, again,
what was it that grabbed you about it?
It's an important story. It's an important story for women. These are women who society has become frustrated with, or cast aside, or thrown away. And I thought, here in this town this wonderful town that I'm so privileged to be able to work in and do, be a librarian in, you know, what was going on here? You know, how come this story hasn't been told? How come this story is just sort of around the edges? Why isn't this more known? I mean, if Elizabeth Munger was known nationally and internationally, she did travel to Germany in the 1930s. Now that does put us in Nazi territory, but Germany had a progressive part before the Nazis took over. Again, we've been here before. How did it go off the rails? You know. So how is this incredibly important thing now in the middle of our town? And back to the book group, it's like having this prison in the middle of town that no one really talks about it anymore. It's just there, and it's closed off, and it's not part of the town. And you know, I was curious. something good was going on here, and what was it? Not something great. Again, there were certainly problems. These women were held against their will, and they may have needed to have been there or not. Who knows? But there's something there, and I think it just made me curious.
When's the last time you've been there?
Oh, not for many years. I volunteered briefly with one of the college in prison programs as an embedded librarian.
Yes.
But that didn't last too long, and of course, a lot of that shut down during COVID and whatnot. So I haven't been back for a long time. But if you drive around Niantic, you drive by it all the time.
It's huge. It's a big place now, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, a whole different campus was built after 1968. A modern prison was built in the buildings, the cottages,
Yep.
and they were cottages, and the school and all that. The chapel were kind of shut down, and everything was moved to another part of the prison that was more modern. 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, with the more punitive approach that came in with the war on drugs.
And what is the more punitive approach? What is that? What does that look like?
I don't know that I can speak to that exactly, because I'm not an expert on the prison, but there's certainly no farm left. They're not learning how to grow healthy food or whatnot. There's a few sunflowers here and there, at least when I was there, but and there are education programs, but it doesn't look like the same robustness of what had been there before. Just because, in some ways, because the numbers went so up. I don't fault the DOC, because we asked them to do an impossible thing, and we don't give them the funds, the resources to do it.
Yes.
They're doing the best they can with
Yep.
what little they have.
Yep.
It's in some ways you can't compare today with 1918 in terms of that, but in some ways you can. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Do you have any indication of why it switched to the DOC in 1968?
I don't. And interestingly enough, well, in 1968, I mean, the year itself, just American history tells you everything,
Yes.
was, even more than it has the past few years, was just in chaos, and things were changing quickly. In 1970, in New Haven, of course, there was the Black Panthers trial that was famous in Connecticut history, if you're old enough to remember that. And there were women Black Panthers, and they were held in Niantic. And Niantic at that Niantic Women's Prison at that time was still the farm. And there were no fences, there were no nothing. And they're starting to get this fear that, we've got the Black Panthers here.
Ooh, they're coming into our community.
And I don't think the community said that. I don't think, but all of a sudden, there's that uneasiness of 1968.
Well, 1968 was horrible.
Yeah, I was 2, I don't remember it.
Yes.
But, suddenly they decided they wanted the women's prison as part of the state. And there were probably good reasons and not good reasons for that. But,
Personal safety versus corrections.
Yeah, exactly. Things changed fast. A lot more drugs flowed into our society for whatever reason. And it's only a few years after that Nixon starts the war on drugs, where now it's becoming a race thing. We're going to, Lisabeth, the book, The New Jim Crow, I'm forgetting the author, is a fantastic one to read. How, Jim Crow goes away in the civil rights movement and gets reasserted in American society through the war on drugs and incarcerating people of color, way out of proportion to what they are in society. So, a lot happens fast there that changes it and makes it the institution that it is today.
Yeah.
And again, the DOC is trying, I think sincerely trying to set up programs. I know there are some newer programs where they are exploring more with skills and education and whatnot, but I don't know that they have the funds to do what they could do.
Sure.
We certainly don't want to, as a society, we don't want to spend money on prisons if we could spend it elsewhere. But it is cheaper to send a person to college than it is to send them to prison. So something's got to give. This could all work a lot better some way,
Yeah, we have more people in prison
than we do in college. We spend more in prisons than we do in college. So what are we trying to achieve here?
What's the message?
Right, yeah. So let's try to, make it progressive. But again, we've been here before and it didn't work. So why not?
Why not?
Why not?
Lisa, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for tonight's show. I hope you have enjoyed my special guest, Lisa Timothy. I have. Watch both parts of her interview right here on What's Your Story. I'm your host, James Ransom Reed, Jr. Until next time, everybody has a story. What's yours? Good night.
Water's warm at Jaws Pond, and we're stocked full of treasures. Big or small, we buy it all. We buy and sell fast rides, power tools, vintage guitars, and so much more. Walk the plank in style with our fine jewelry, diamonds, and watches. Plus, we have a huge selection of the latest video games, including the new PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. Jaws Pond, conveniently located on Meriden Waterbury Turnpike in Southington and West Main Street in New Britain.
I'm your host, Kurt Barwis. Today, I have a very special guest, Dr. Andrew Lyme.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Veterans Corner. My name's Chuck Wooden.
Decision for ourselves for this week, if we want to be made well.
Hi, welcome to the crack of dawn. It's Dawn Lombardi. I'm starting the painting. It's going to be the cliffs with some water. Love it.
He took me on the sets of Lost in Space, Batman.
Everybody has a story. What's yours? Until next time,